I would like to take you on a journey with me to a city, the S5 city, a city bordering on the city of Zurich, a city you may actually live in if you live in Adlershausen, Uster, Wetzikon, Rapperswil, Jona or Gröningen. It's a city with about 300,000 people living there. It's a city which most of you don't know and which most people living there don't think they live in. So what is this S5 city? We actually used it as a metaphor in order to get ourselves and all the people involved in the project to think about this area, this region, as something else than agglomeration, than just a collection of communities. What is it? Is it a city? Does it have an identity? Landscapes? Yes, certainly. Nature? Maybe not exactly your idea of nature. Is it an agglomeration? Not an image of what we usually consider as agglomerations. If we think about agglomerations, we very often think about urban sprawl, about high density, about lack of culture, about traffic congestion, and so forth. So here you actually see the S5 city map. It follows the train track of the S5 rapid train going from Zurich-Stadelhofen on one branch to Pfäffikon, Schwyz. The establishment of the S5 city line about 20 years ago radically changed the appearance of this area and radically also changed the kind of people who lived there. What we wanted to do, we wanted to look at this area not with this notion of, oh my God, agglomeration. I mean, for us urbanites, we always think living in the agglo is not very sexy, right? Living in the city, that's the thing to do. We wanted to say, what is it really? I mean, is it a collection of suburbs? What is this agglomeration? Or could it be an AgglOasis? So our approach to this project was to ask ourselves, let's find out what are the special qualities, the special characteristics of this kind of region in which most of the people, incidentally, in the world live. The majority does not live in core, beautiful cities like Vancouver or Shanghai or Zurich, but many of them, most of them, live in urbanized areas around those cities. This research project involved a lot of people. Over 30 researchers were involved from different disciplines, from 8 different kinds of research institutions. They looked at 10 or better even 11 topics. And the project was special in that it took both a top-down and a bottom-up approach. We asked experts, planners, local actors, politicians. But of bigger interest was really what is the perspective, what is the view of the people living in this area? What is their sense of identity? What is important to them? So one project looked at the contours, and that raised the question, if you ask somebody living in the S5 city, what does it mean for you to live here? I mean, what are the pictures you have in your mind? What are the qualities you like, or what are the things that you don't like about living here? There was a project about politics. Politics meant to look at the decision-making processes in the communities that shape the space in the region. It also was to look at what are the political processes, who makes what kinds of decision, how do the structures work that lead to the kind of outputs that we have. There's a big project looking at the meaning of nature and green spaces, again in the eyes of the population. There was another project looking at economic development. This particular region of Zurich has a proud history. Many of you may know that it was the textile industry that made it very famous 150 years ago, and then the textile machinery production. So this area has a long history of industrial development. Now, living in an agglomeration also means you need infrastructure. You need educational facilities, you need shops, you need leisure options. So one project looked at what are the infrastructural possibilities there, what are the schools that are offered, what about childcare, what about leisure activities, how do people behave, what do they use and how do they touch it. Another project looked at everyday mobilities. How do people live in the space? What do they do when they get on the S train early in the morning? Do they knit? Do they read the paper? Do they use their phone? Do they eat their lunch? Whatever, and what does it mean to them? Then a big area is housing. How do people live? What are their dreams about living in the agglomeration? And what is the reality about life there? Another project looked at changing neighborhoods. How does new communication, new ways of living change the ways in which we interact with neighbors in different kinds of housing settings? Finally, what are options in terms of urban design, especially in industrial areas? And last but not least, and maybe overarching, the question of how sustainable is the development in the area. And the 11th project was one about facts and figures, where we really looked at how has the population developed over time, how many jobs are there, what are the developments, collecting all those statistics and trying to make nice maps of them. The project was different in as much as it was not just meant to be a research project, not meant to produce a report for the shelf, or not to be an ivory tower project for a small group to understand what's going on in this area. No, from the beginning, we said a big part has to be the transfer. We want to bring the findings out to the people living in the area. And for that, my colleagues came up with a lot of smart ideas for how we could do that. Here you actually see the kickoff event. We had a 130 square meter aerial map developed for the reasons, with original photographs by Swiss Topo, who is producing these maps for the national defense, among other things. And it was amazing to see how people loved to walk around on this map and to see, oh, where exactly do we live? Is it that house? Is it that house? It was a fascinating thing. And this map is still in Usto, in front of the City Hall for a while, and will again be there later on, because it is a fascinating thing for people to find themselves, to locate themselves in space, but of course also with the idea to actually get a picture of the bigger area in which they live and to look beyond their balcony or the neighbor's house. Now, this area has changed a lot. I've said it before. There are about 300,000 people living there in 26 communities, depending on how you draw the boundary. And it has changed a lot. Urban sprawl is a topic. The communities are growing. A lot of new housing is built constantly. So in order to develop some ideas, well, how could we continue to develop the area? We quickly need to look at what are the drivers of urban sprawl, what has driven this development. One important one is certainly economic development, high-quality jobs, a variety of jobs that draw people to the area, business and industry. Education and infrastructure, I already mentioned it, that's important. What kind of schooling is available, what kind of other opportunities are there for leisure opportunities, for sports, whatever. Then infrastructure, shopping, etc. Cars to be put somewhere, or trains, which may use a bit less space. Housing is important. Many of you who are from the area know that finding a place to live in Zurich is really sort of a bit of a miracle if it happens to you, especially if you're not really rich. Now, for many people, they might love to stay in the city, but they actually move to the area because housing is more affordable, because it may be possible to buy a condominium or to buy even a house and to be close to nature. This, however, as you see it, a lot of construction activity going on drives urban sprawl and raises questions as to the future development. And ironically, maybe the biggest driver of urban sprawl here is actually the beauty of nature that we find in this particular region. It is a region. It's a very attractive place. Many of you may know it, with different lakes, with hills, the Bachtel, with many different natural qualities that actually attract people. And the prerequisite for all this to happen is accessibility, mobility, and transportation. So the question we ask, well, how do we want to live? If we continue business as usual, the area may continue to become more and more red. What you see on this map is all the built-up area, the red area. You see there are still some green islands. However, with the continuation of development, imagine what it will look like when it's all red. So, some smart people asked in our group, what if we would transform it into an AgglOasis? What if we think about the area around Bachtel and all the green spaces as Central Park? What if we consider the area around Männedorf, Vermeilen as Lakeside or Lake Drive Avenue, all built over? What if we think of the area along Uster, Wetzikon, the traditional textile industry areas, as Weaver's Valley? So this idea is an interesting one, we found, and many other people found it interesting too. The AgglOasis is an interesting concept because you can look at it in many different ways. Every lovely city has some kind of a center. Could be Central Park in New York, could be old houses or an old traditional built-up center in a city, but AgglOasis need centers, and there are different kinds of parts of AgglOasis. So if you take the S5 area, this may be the own private AgglOasis of many people who live there. It's actually mine. I live in Zurich, but I love to go outside on the weekends, and I have some friends who, this garden is theirs, and it's a great place to be, I tell you. The only problem is that the cows can't, or the flies can't distinguish between cows and people, so that sometimes makes it a bit difficult. Or it could be this, another part of the AgglOasis, some built-up area along the beautiful Lützel Lake. So one challenge is how can we combine, how can we preserve those lovely, beautiful natural area with the built-up space, and how can we smartly build and try to contain the edges of the built parts while preserving the unique local qualities of these different places. The same is true for housing. This, incidentally, is actually a house. It's about 150 years old. It's in Uster. It was particularly built for Italian young ladies working in the textile industry, and the house was reserved for the ladies so they wouldn't be in danger of mingling with the men in their spare time. It has been renovated very softly. It's an attractive place where people live today. And finally, really the bigger question of a big park, a big nature park, looking at the area from the green, not from the built-up areas, and conceiving what would it look like if it were a natural park, if we would add more water, maybe more smaller lakes, and preserve the qualities it has. So if we had a vision and say, well, okay, let's say 20 years ago, this area actually was an AgglOasis, everybody would agree to that it is one. What would it take? And there need to be some changes for us to get there. What it would take a new planning paradigm. It would be planners and people who support this kind of thinking by the politicians and by the planners to really focus centrally on the interconnected green spaces and the nature parks as the central quality of the area, as the linchpin of the AgglOasis, if you want. That would mean preservation of space, not continuing urban sprawl and more single-family homes and more less density areas. It would mean a focus on the interface between the built space and the natural space in order to create attractive fringes to the communities. And it might mean minimizing zoning regulation instead of maximizing it, considering mixed use as maybe an asset, linking housing with services, etc., and not separating all these different functions. And finally, a radical thought, not everybody likes, that maybe we should focus on minimum rather than maximum densities. In our today's planning, we always think about, well, the maximum density is this is how much you can build. Maybe we should start thinking the other way around, at least for the built-up areas. How can we maximize the use of space in order to preserve the other qualities? And then we have a very fine tradition, which, however, also creates some problems. In Switzerland, as you know, we have very high local autonomy at the community level, and the kind of decision-making at the community level in many ways is really out of sync of the dynamic of urbanization processes. So deciding in the small community of Wetzikon or Bubikon or even smaller ones, well, how are we going to deal with the little bit of land that we have? How many more taxpayers can we attract? That may be okay for the local level, but if you look at the general picture, as you saw before, it may create an unattractive situation. So while we want to preserve those local qualities of autonomy, we also need stronger regional planning association looking at the whole and looking at what are unique qualities of each of these communities. How can they be developed as opposed to having a little bit of business, a little bit of service, a little bit of housing everywhere. Now this would probably require some financial compensation system, because if one community decides, well, we are not now building this big box office buildings, or we are not building this or that, we are focusing on housing, for example, or preserving this landscape that we have, or this lake that we have, then they would have to benefit, if they choose a zero growth strategy, from the surplus value that is generated in other communities where a decision is made to meaningfully concentrate business or service activities. There would be much more to tell, but if you're interested, you can read more on our website, which is continuously updated, which also gives you an overview of all our transfer activities, which among them involve open access, of course, an e-reader, which will be published this month with all the research report, and an attractively illustrated book for the general audience, for all the people in the S5 city, and whoever else is interested, this coming spring. Thank you very much. Thank you to all the researchers that were involved, my research team. Thank you, and I hope that you will join us in the vision of creating more AgglOasis and less agglo deserts. Thank you very much.